Darkcast Network, indie pods with a dark side.
Hey, little skeletons. I'm Gina.
I'm Amber.
And this is Weird True Crime.
We're still recovering from an awesome weekend at the True Crime and Paranormal Podcast Festival. It was our first time attending an event of this nature, and we literally had no idea what to expect. But we ended up meeting so many wonderful podcasters and true crime fans. It is shocking when someone you just met tells you they've listened to the podcast. I was
Like,
not
what?
okay.
Really?
I mean, I was okay, but you know what I mean. We loved it so much that we may have already bought tickets to attend next year's festival in Denver, Colorado. Who knows? Maybe you'll see us on a panel. Do you know where you can see us, though? Every week on your feed when you subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app. Don't forget, we have ad-free options and other goodies available when you join the Skeleton Crew over on Patreon.
Not only did we meet many incredible people, we learned so much. The way the true crime podcast community supports each other is truly inspiring, and we hope to be able to do the same for others. Okay, that's enough gushing. It's time to get into today's episode. We're doing what I would call a Gina-centric case and taking it old school, all the way back to Christmas Eve of 1945. This is a case that has baffled investigators and haunted a family for decades. The mysterious disappearance of the Sodder children. A fire destroyed their home, but 5 of the children vanished without a trace. Let's dive in to this perplexing tale.
To understand the events of that fateful night, we need to know more about the Sodder family. George Sodder was born Giorgio Sadu in Tula, Sardinia, Italy in 1895. He immigrated to the United States with his parents and older brother when he was 13 years old. For some unknown reason, his brother turned around and went back home as soon as they landed at Ellis Island. Giorgio Sadu began going by George Sodder and found work on the Pennsylvania railroads carrying water and supply for laborers. He then moved to Smithers, West Virginia, where he used his intelligence and ambition to climb from truck driver to owner of the Dempsey Transfer Company. One day, he walked into a local store called the Music Box and met the owner's daughter, Jenny Cipriani, who came to the States when she was 3. It's fair to say we know how that meet-cute ended.
Between the years of 1923 and 1943, George and Jenny had 10 children. John, Joseph, Marion, George Jr., Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Betty, and Sylvia. That's a lot of kids. Because of George Sr.'s successful trucking company, the family lived in a nice-sized 2-story house a couple of miles outside of town. Fayetteville and the surrounding area had a relatively large population of Italian immigrants, which is really saying something considering the entire town only had around 1,600 people in 1945. The Sodders were well respected in their small town, and George was known for having strong opinions on everything from business to events to politics. George was not quiet about his dislike for Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, and it led to arguments with members of the Italian community in Fayetteville. Just to give a 2-second history lesson, Benito Mussolini was the first fascist dictator in Italy, ruling from 1923 to 1943. He was shot to death in April of 1945 while trying to escape from Sardinia dressed as a German soldier. George was not a fan of Mussolini and his fascist ways, which probably made for some not-so-friendly conversations at the local establishments. This fact is important because it plays into one of the many theories about what happened that Christmas Eve night.
Before George began his own business, he worked for a man named Fiorenzo Genitolo. Not only was he George's boss, they were friendly enough that Fiorenzo co-signed on a $1,500 loan from the Bank of Fayetteville. George had a $1,500 mortgage insurance on the house, along with a mortgage clause payable to Genitolo if something were to happen to the home. It's alleged that Genitolo increased the insurance to $1,750 without consulting the Sodders. About 60 days before the fire, it is said that Genitolo requested that a local insurance salesman by the name of Russell Long reach out to the Sodders and write insurance on them and all 10 of their children. But the Sodders refused to buy any life insurance. The story goes that after the Sodders refused the life insurance, Genitolo told them, quote, "Your house is going up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed," end quote. And also that George was going to be, quote, paid for the dirty remarks he had been making about Mussolini. Of course, all of this information is alleged, so we don't know if Genitolo really did try to have life insurance taken out on the family or if he threatened them. He did get the insurance payout after the house burned down, though.
Isn't that so shitty? You lose 5 of your kids and your old boss gets the money for your house. That's just salt in the wounds.
Kick them when they're down.
About a month before the fire, a stranger had come to the home looking for hauling work. George didn't have any work to offer him at the time, but the man creepily hung around the property for a while. He was looking at the 2 fuse boxes that George had installed in the back of the house when he made the remark that, quote, "These are going to cause a fire one day," end quote. George brushed it off, though, because he had had the fuse boxes inspected by an electrician after they were installed to make sure that everything was up to code. The electrician gave him the green light and said that everything looked great. While this is probably more coincidental than anything, it's still eerie given what took place not long after. And speaking of eerie, a couple of days before the fire, 2 of the surviving children saw a man watching the younger Sodder children coming home from school on Highway 21.
Let's jump into what happened that night, and then we'll dig deeper into the theories. On December 24th, 1945, 17-year-old Marion Sodder came home from her job at the local dime store, think like dollar store, with presents she had purchased for her 5 younger siblings for Christmas. Marion bought the gifts with her own money and was anxious to hand them out, so Jenny, the kind mom that she was, let them enjoy one early present. Needless to say, kids don't want to go to bed when they have shiny new toys to play with. Jenny allowed Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty to stay up late with the promise that Maurice and Louis would complete their nightly chores, feeding the cows and closing the chicken coop. Marion stayed up to watch after them and help put the girls to bed once they were ready. Jenny swooped up 3-year-old Sylvia, and they headed to bed with George around 10 p.m. The oldest boys, John and George Sr., also headed to bed where they slept in the attic. It's important to note that all of the children, besides baby Sylvia, slept in the attic of the home. There are differing reports about if the children slept on the second floor of the home or in the attic, but newspaper reports quoting Jenny Sodder state that the children slept in the attic, so that's what we're going with here.
Right around midnight, Jenny heard the house phone ring and got out of bed to pick it up. Jenny probably isn't sleeping well if she shares her room with a toddler, so she more than likely realized it was ringing before anyone else did. This is the 40s. We're talking home phones plugged into the wall in the family room, not a cell phone on your bedside table. When she answers the phone, a woman asks for a man she doesn't know. Upon telling her she had the wrong number, Jenny recalls the woman giving a weird laugh before hanging up. This fact has been discussed pretty frequently, but investigators did discover later that this was just a neighbor who had called the wrong house. Jenny ambled back to bed, noticing Marion asleep on the couch, holding a magazine. The lights were still on and the doors were unlocked, routine chores the children usually did before turning it in for the night. As she dozed off again, she was startled by what sounded like a large thud on the roof, followed by the object tumbling down the side of the house to the ground. Probably annoyed and tired, she dismissed the sound and fell asleep. About 30 minutes later, smoke began pouring into the master bedroom of the home. Jenny, awakened by the smell of smoke, popped up to investigate. When she opened the bedroom door, she found the main living room engulfed in flames. After waking George up, she ran to the base of the attic stairs and yelled for the 7 sleeping children to get out of the house. Meanwhile, Marion grabbed baby Sylvia from her crib and ran outside into the bitter cold night.
The older boys, John and George Jr., sleepily stumble outside, their hair singed from the fire. George Sr. found a bucket and attempted to fill it with water from the water barrel, only to discover it had frozen solid. This is when he realized that 5 of his children, Maurice, 14, Martha Lee, 12, Louis, 10, Ginny, 8, and Betty, 6, were still in the attic. Frantic to save his youngest children, George attempted to scale the side of the house but was unsuccessful. He then went to the side of the house to get the ladder that was always in the same place, but it was nowhere to be found. George and the older boys hopped into the 2 work trucks on the property with the intention of backing them up to the house and getting into the second floor, but neither engine would start. There has been a lot of conspiracy and speculation about why neither truck would start, but the true reason is much less exciting. Cold temperatures cause a vehicle's battery to produce less current, and the engine oil can thicken, thus slowing down the flow. While the theory that someone tampered with the trucks is more interesting, the truth is it was just too cold outside and the work trucks couldn't start. It only took 45 minutes for the roof of the house to collapse into the basement.
A neighbor tried to call the local volunteer fire department, but couldn't contact the night operator, probably due to it being Christmas. Another neighbor actually found Chief F.J. Morris a little after 1 a.m. and informed him of the fire. In 1945, there wasn't a fire siren, and trying to gather the troops consisted of a phone tree where one volunteer would call another and then another until they had a good group of guys to go put out the fire. The fire department was only 2.5 miles from the Sodder home, but Chief Morris couldn't drive the fire truck himself for some reason, so he couldn't do anything until the other firefighters arrived. Why he was the fire chief and couldn't drive the truck is a whole other topic that I don't really understand. But because of this, the volunteer fire department didn't arrive at the Sodder home until 8 a.m., a solid 7 hours after the fire started. In an interview with NPR, Sterling Lewis, the West Virginia State Fire Marshal, said that it wouldn't have mattered if they had shown up within 10 minutes of the fire starting. The self-contained breathing apparatus that firefighters wear didn't exist in 1945, so they couldn't enter a house that was actively on fire. That doesn't mean they wouldn't show up and try to douse the flames from the exterior, but there would be no rescue attempts happening inside the home. Once the smoldering ashes had been put out and the police were on the scene, it was only investigated for 2 hours. A normal investigation of this magnitude would take several days, if not weeks. But because of the holiday, everyone was in a hurry to get back home to celebrate. All that was left of the home was a basement full of ashes. What wasn't found? The 5 remaining Sodder children.
You heard her right. There was no solid evidence discovered that told investigators the children's bodies were in the rubble. Police told George and Jenny that the children had been burned to ash in the fire. Fire Chief Morris suggested that the Sodders scoop up some of the ash left behind, put them in a box, and bury them. Yep. Just use some of the ashes left at the scene as cremains because there are probably some parts of the children mixed in with the wreckage. The grieving parents were also told that the fire started due to faulty wiring. This explanation did nothing but raise more questions. George had recently installed electric wiring to power a stove in the home, and he found the assessment odd because it had been approved by a contractor. Jenny didn't understand how faulty electric wires could have been the issue, considering the lights in the house were still on when the fire started. In one resource, she mentioned vividly remembering the lights being on because she wouldn't have been able to find her way out of the house if they were off. Investigators found the missing ladder in a ditch about 75 meters from the house and also noted that their phone line had been cut near the top of the telephone pole. This would explain why George couldn't find his ladder. Whoever cut the line probably used the ladder and then slung it in the nearby ditch.
Because it was Christmas Day, no thorough search was performed, and the devastated family was told they'd come back another day to investigate the scene more completely. The site wasn't roped off or guarded to ensure it wasn't disturbed. The fire marshal simply told George Sauter to leave it as it was and they would, quote, come back to finish the job, end quote. However, before a week had passed, George bulldozed 5 feet of fresh dirt over the basement and turned the plot of land where the house stood into a memorial garden. He felt that no one was ever coming back to investigate any further, and in his grief and frustration, he simply wanted to honor his children instead of leaving a pile of rubble and ash. It's easy to understand why he felt this way, but his actions contaminated the scene, making it much harder to find any remains. The coroner's office issued 5 death certificates just before the new year, citing the cause of death as fire or suffocation.
The one incident they did figure out relatively quickly was what happened to the telephone wire. While the Sauter family was desperately trying to rescue their children from the fire, Lonnie Johnson and Dave Atkins were using it as a decoy to steal a block and tackle from another building on the Sauter property. A block and tackle is a system of 2 or more pulleys with a rope or cable threaded between them, usually used to lift heavy loads. Johnson and Atkins owned and operated a beer joint near the Sauter home. Neighbors saw the men in the act and recognized them, turning them in to the police later. Johnson pleaded guilty to theft, paid a $25 fine, and was released. He also admitted to cutting the phone line with a set of pliers, but there's no clear answer about why he would have cut them. My guess is he didn't want any of the neighbors who recognized them to be able to call the authorities. Atkins, on the other hand, cut and run, joining the army to avoid prosecution, and wasn't heard from for at least 2 years.
George and Jenny began to think that the fire was a distraction for a kidnapping. Part of this theory was because of the nonsense around the claims of faulty wiring. If faulty wiring had started the fire, then how would the lights have remained on while the family was escaping the home? George notes that he never heard any of the children cry out for help during the fire or saw them at the windows trying to get out. However, according to nationwidechildrens.org, it's not unusual for young children to become disoriented or confused during a house fire. They tend to hide somewhere, like in a closet or under a bed, instead of trying to escape. Let's dive into some of the weirder aspects of this story. None of the electrical appliances in the home were destroyed in the fire, which is curious, considering it burned for hours.
Jenny hypothesized that if the electrical appliances in the home remained intact, the bones of her children might too. She began holding on to chicken and pork chop bones from their family dinners and placing them into her wooden stove. Once the fire went out, she'd find the bones right where she'd left them, charred but intact. A local crematorium employee informed her that bones still remain after bodies are burned for 2 hours at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And as gruesome as it is, human flesh gives off a rather pungent odor when burned. We're talking about 5 people burning alive in a fire at the same time. No one reported smelling anything. Not long after her science experiments, Ginny read an article about another house fire in town where 7 people died, including a 3-month-old girl. The skeletal remains of all 7 victims were found, and that's when Ginny and George really started second-guessing what happened to their children. A bus driver actually came forward not long after the tragedy, stating he saw balls of fire being tossed onto the Sodders' roof. Around 3 months later, while visiting the site of the fire, toddler Sylvia found a hard, rubber object in the yard. Upon investigating, George determined it was a napalm pineapple bomb, the type of bomb commonly used in warfare. Remember, Ginny heard a large thud hit the roof and a rolling sound right before the fire started. Could this be what the witness saw being tossed on the roof that night?
Then, reports of sightings began. A woman claimed to have seen the missing children looking out of a passing car while the fire was still in progress. And then a woman who worked at a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston, 50 miles west, said that she saw the children the morning after the fire. She told police that she served them breakfast and saw a car with Florida license plates that they then got into. Then, in Charleston, a woman at a hotel saw the children's photos in a newspaper and said she had seen 4 of the 5 a week after the fire. In a statement, she said, quote, "The children were accompanied by 2 women and 2 men, all of Italian extraction. I do not remember the exact date. However, the entire party did register at the hotel and stayed in a large room with several beds. They registered about midnight. I tried to talk to the children in a friendly manner, but the men appeared hostile and refused to allow me to talk to these children. One of the men looked at me in a hostile manner. He turned around and began talking rapidly in Italian. Immediately, the whole party stopped talking to me. I sensed that I was being frozen out, and so I said nothing more. They left early the next morning." End quote.
2 years after the fire ripped apart the Sodder family, George saw a newspaper photo of school children in New York and was certain that one of them was his daughter, Betty. Desperate to see the child in person, he jumps into one of his trucks and hightails it to Manhattan. Understandably spooked by his claim, the parents or teachers responsible for the child refuse to let him see her. But he doesn't give up. He's now convinced that his children are still alive somewhere. George and Jenny then reached out to the current FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, to ask for help in investigating the disappearance of their children. They received a response from him that read, quote, "Although I would like to be of service, the matter related appears to be of local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of this bureau." End quote. Hoover's agents said they would absolutely assist if permission from local authorities was given. Unfortunately, Fayetteville authorities declined to investigate further.
The Sodders hired a pathologist, Oscar B. Hunter, who excavated the dirt from the site of the fire and found 4 pieces of human vertebrae. He sent them to the Smithsonian Institute to be tested, and they came back to be lumbar vertebrae belonging to a child between the ages of 16 and 17. The lumbar bones began to fuse between 16 and 23 years old. But the oldest missing child was Maurice, who was only 14 years old. Also, it was determined that these bones had never been in a fire. The explanation was that George must have moved the bones to the site while covering up the location of the fire. So, okay, whose bones do those belong to? That's another mystery to add to the pile. And instead of holding on to the bones to try and determine who they belong to, they simply gave them back to George to do with what he wanted, which is very strange. After this happened, The Fayetteville County prosecutor said they would only reopen the investigation if evidence of kidnapping came to light. They are really over the family at this point, even though they're just trying to get answers. And, once again, Fayetteville authorities didn't even handle it properly.
It's probably no surprise that disbelief of the children's deaths led to off-the-wall theories about what happened to them that night. One of the theories going around town was that the Italian mafia was involved. Community members were whispering that the children had been taken back to Italy by the mafia and sold to an orphanage. Someone in Florida claimed that the children were with one of Jenny's relatives in Florida. Jenny's siblings and their children were all tested to prove that none of them were the missing Sodder kids. In Davenport, California, the sheriff received a letter that one of the children was attending school in the city. The photographs of every school child in the city were looked at, and none of them were identified as a Sodder child. John Sodder, the oldest son, agreed that if his siblings were kidnapped, they would be taken to Italy. Why? Perhaps because George was talking shit about Mussolini.
23 years after the fire, in 1968, half of a photograph was sent to George and Jenny. The photograph was of a man in his 20s who looked eerily similar to an adult version of 9-year-old Louis. Written on the back of the photo was, quote, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Illy Boys A90132 or 35, end quote. There were thoughts that the numbers were associated with zip codes in Italy, but they could never verify that. But that's what they thought that those numbers meant. And obviously there was no brother Frankie, so not much telling what that means either. And of course, they wanted to understand where this photo came from, so they hired a detective to go to Kentucky and investigate. But in a strange twist, the detective went missing and was never heard from again. It could be that the detective was really just a con artist who took their money and ran. But maybe he really did go missing in the quest to find out more about the photograph, or found out something he wasn't supposed to know and, was taken care of. In a news article commemorating the 23rd anniversary of the fire, George was quoted saying, "As long as we live, we will dig into it to come out with an explanation on what really happened 23 years ago in that fire."
In a last-ditch effort, George and Jenny erected a billboard on Route 16 with pictures of the 5 missing children and all of the information they had gathered throughout the years. The billboard remained standing for over 40 years and offered a reward of $10,000 for any relevant information. We'll share a picture of the billboard, but here is what it said. On Christmas Eve, 1945, our home was set afire and 5 of our children, ages 5 through 14, kidnapped. The officials blamed defective wiring, although lights were still burning after the fire started. The official report stated that the children died in the fire. However, no bones were found in the residue, and there was no smell of burning flesh during or after the fire. What was the motive of the law officers involved? What did they have to gain by making us suffer all these years of injustice? Why did they lie and force us to accept those lies?
The Sodders hired another private detective named C.C. Hensley. Hensley spoke with a member of the coroner's jury who were brought in to help the coroner determine the cause of the children's death, and discovered he was actually one of the life insurance salesmen who worked with Fiorenzo to try and convince the Sodders to take out life insurance not long before the fire. Remember, the coroner's jury said it was a matter of faulty wiring. Hensley also talked to Sterling Lewis, the fire marshal who was on the scene. Sterling Lewis said he talked to everyone who was on the scene that morning, and they all said they found human remains. When asked why no one spoke about finding human remains, Lewis said they were probably in a rush and not paying attention to the human remains found because it was a holiday. So, this makes it sound like the officials and volunteers avoided the fact that there were human remains because they didn't want to spend their Christmas day processing the scene.
In 1945, when searching for human remains in a fire, investigators would look for remnants of internal organs, which would be bright red among the ash and rubble. Because what Sterling Lewis, the fire marshal, was saying didn't line up with what Fire Chief F.J. Morris stated about the bones being cremated in the fire, Tinsley, badass detective extraordinaire, went looking for answers. He found a minister whom Morris told in a confession that he had found a heart in the ashes. Morris said he put the heart in a box where the house once stood. Tinsley convinced Morris to show him where he buried the heart and dig it up. Upon digging up the box, it was discovered that it wasn't a heart at all, but a beef liver that had obviously never been in a fire. Morris said he did it as a way to provide closure to the Sodder family. I will never understand why people think making up false reports or burying a freaking beef liver and saying it was a child's heart brings any sort of closure. Not to mention, he did it because he got caught, not doing his job. Not because he cared about the Sodders.
Unfortunately, Tinsley's investigative work did nothing but raise more questions. Almost 80 years later, all we have now are theories about what happened on that Christmas night in 1945. Some theorize that the local Italian mafia tried to recruit George, and when he declined, they kidnapped their kids and set the house on fire, like we said. This doesn't make sense, though, because why would they only kidnap the youngest kids? And why would they kidnap them from the second floor during a fire? Common sense tells us that this isn't likely. Another widely believed theory is that they were kidnapped when they went out late that night to finish their chores, and the fire was started afterward as a diversion. This does make some sense considering the reports of someone watching the children on their way home from school. George died in 1969 at 74 years old. Jenny lived much longer and spent her life building rooms onto her home and constructing fences around her property to keep people out. She only wore black clothing and kept a flower garden around the spot of the fire. So sad. She passed away in 1989 at the age of 89. The billboard was taken down soon after, over 40 years after it was originally constructed.
Sylvia Sodder, the toddler who was only 2 at the time of the fire, passed away in 2021 at the age of 79. She strongly believed that her siblings did not die in the fire. She said she could remember the sounds of her father screaming and crying for his children during the fire. Jenny, Sylvia's daughter, told the Times West Virginian that anyone with information to post it on websleuths.com. Quote, "My mom told my grandmother she would never let this story die. That's what my brother and I are doing now." End quote. So what do you think, G? Did they all die in the fire or were they kidnapped?
While I understand George and Jenny's desire to believe that their children were still alive and out in the world somewhere, I think they did die in the fire. As we learned, young children are easily disoriented in a situation like that, so they probably didn't wake up enough to hear the yells from the other family members, and by the time they did wake, maybe visibility was next to nothing, so they hid instead of trying to escape. I do believe that remains were found the following morning, but due to the holiday and no one's willingness to do their jobs, they just said nothing and went home. Then, George contaminated the scene by covering it with 5 feet of dirt, and the rest is history. What do you think?
I agree. I mean, I wish I like you had said, I understand why George did what he did, wanting to just kind of move on and honor his children. But man, maybe we'd have more answers if he hadn't done that. But
Mhm.
I think all likelihood, if you hear, what is the saying? If you hear hoofbeats, you think horse, not zebra.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I mean, obviously they didn't do their due diligence in looking through the fire and investigating. So I think that maybe they did see something, maybe not everything, but they were like, we'll just come back later when it's not Christmas and do this. And, George covered it all up instead of waiting for them to come back. So, I don't want to sit here and say these grieving parents are wrong.
no, they're
But
not.
They're not
The
wrong in
pol-
their hope that they're alive and out there somewhere.
Absolutely.
But I do think they died in the fire. So,
Mm.
and
Christmas or not, you signed up for a
Yeah.
job. You're supposed to do your damn job.
we have this running theme going with some of the stuff we do. Just do your job.
Just do your damn
Anyway,
job.
just do your damn job. I know historical cases aren't really your cup of tea, so thanks for going back in time with me on this one, Amber. She's like, we're doing a historical one, okay. She honestly didn't even know anything about this case. And I made her.
Way to call me out, Gina.
You're welcome. Hey, it's fine. We all like what we like, and it's fine. I've been familiar with this case for a long time and always thought it was really fishy, but now that I've spent hours digging into it, I honestly believe we're just looking at another situation where the people in charge didn't want to do their jobs and left two grieving parents with no solid closure about what happened to their children.
And it doesn't help that Tweedledee and Tweedledum were committing burglary at the same time and kind of effed everything else up, so.
Seriously, it just added so much more confusion to what was happening. What asshats? Oh, this house is on fire. Let's go. They were probably like at the beer joint, which was right next to the Sodders, and they probably saw the fire and was like, oh, this is the perfect opportunity to go steal something while people aren't looking.
Moment of opportunity to be a big, giant douchebag. Anyway, make sure you're following us on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at Weird True Crime to see pictures, videos, and other behind-the-scenes goodness. Do you have a case to request, or maybe even a listener tale? Email it to us at weirdtruecrime@gmail.com. We'll be back next week with another episode of What the Fuck Wednesday.
Yeah, we will. It's going to be a good one, too. You don't want to miss it. We actually have a lot of great content in the works, including more interviews with some truly inspiring people. So until next time, stay safe.
And make good choices.
Bye.
Bye-bye. My happy flower scared the shit out of me. That's why I went like that.
It's your own flower.
Jump scared by an inanimate object.
I just started calling it that. I was like, I don't want to call it Patreon. It needs a fun name. And I was like, it's all skeleton related. So I was like, they can be the skeleton crew. I feel like Amber would be okay with it. Yeah, little skeleton crew.
Man, is Amber going to be okay with a whole bunch of skeleton-themed things? Gee, I have no idea. She began holding on to chicken and pork chop bones. Why did I say it like that?
Chop bones.
I went like fucking full AI there for some reason.
Pork chop